Hello and welcome to the Legal Edition. I'm your host, Attorney Mary Kay Loyan. Our guest today is Professor David Noll, co-author of the riveting book, Vigilante Nation: How State-Sponsored Terror Threatens Our Democracy. Professor Noll is an Associate Dean for Faculty Research and Development and Professor of Law at Rutgers Law School. He is a graduate of Columbia University and New York University School of Law and is an academic fellow of the National Civil Justice Institute. Let's welcome Professor Noll. Welcome, Professor Noll.
Very good to be with you.
Now, you wrote the book, Vigilante Nation. You're one of the co-authors of that book. What prompted you to write this book?
So, there's been a lot of writing about democratic decline and whether the United States is slipping into authoritarianism. But my co-author John Michaels at UCLA and I noticed that these works weren't paying a lot of attention to a phenomenon that we were seeing take place in the states. And that was that state legislatures and state executives were encouraging vigilantes to enforce the MAGA agenda through laws, executive orders, sometimes even court decisions, and sort of enlist everyday people, as snitches, as whistleblowers. And so we started working on this in 2020 and 2021 at the beginning of the Biden administration. And the further we got into it, the more of these measures that we found. And so this was really an effort to document what was going on in the states and to look at how states were empowering vigilantes. And we found that sort of across a wide swath of red states, Texas, Oklahoma, Florida, places like that, there was a concerted effort to empower vigilantes and to enlist them in the enforcement of the MAGA agenda. And so our book is an attempt to document that first and show what these states have been doing. But then we also try to show how empowering vigilantes really threatens democracy and the way that democracy is supposed to function.
Now, talk a little bit about that. What does that look like?
For sure. Well, sort of probably the best historical analog for this is the situation in the Deep South when Jim Crow laws were in effect. If you go back to the period before the Civil Rights Movement, Jim Crow states, had these laws which restricted non-white citizens from participating in politics and being full members of the community. And those laws, right, we tend to associate them with sort of naked discrimination, whites only drinking fountains and stuff like that. But another really important effect of them was to encourage white citizens to really terrorize Black Americans who tried to exercise their legal and their civil rights. And this was, when you go into the history and when you look at first-person accounts of what was happening under Jim Crow, this was a pervasive feature of the Jim Crow South. If people stepped out of line, if they attempted to exercise civil rights, of course, if they attempted to vote, they would be met with violent reprisals. And as John and I see the story, this sort of extra legal vigilantism, right? These ordinary people who took it upon themselves to enforce white supremacy and to suppress Black civil rights is as important to the maintenance of one-party rule and to the breakdown of democracy in the South as those formal discriminatory laws were. And so to connect things up, to the present day, we see a bit of an effort to bring that back. The law may say that, that everybody has equal rights, that everybody's entitled to vote, but say, if you're a family with a gay kid who's in elementary school, right, people snitch on you, or people try to ensure that your kid doesn't have equal access to school facilities. If
We
you're a
even see
teacher,
that we even see that with the abortion issue. We see if women, going out of state for that, they put that snitch practice in place. And these are, white women as well. So it's not based on race, it's based on belief. But, that's another story altogether.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what we, sort of when you think about the targets of today's vigilantism, those targets are defined by a specific worldview, which John and I refer to in the book as Christian nationalism, right? The idea that, right, white Christian people should have power in society, white Christian men specifically should have the power in society. And the people who are pushing these laws and the people who are encouraging vigilantes see different groups holding power as kind of a threat to the way that things should be, or right, a threat to the true social order. And so right, it's not just women, it's not just LGBT people, right, it's not just racial minorities, right, it's anybody who threatens, right, the dominance of people who traditionally held power become targets of vigilantes because right, in this project, right, all of those people are asserting demands for equality and right, and seeking to play their role in democracy. And the project from the vigilantes perspective is to keep them in their place, right, to keep these pesky people from from participating in our politics and making these intrusive demands and forcing what they would describe as the LGBT agenda or the racial justice agenda on right-thinking Americans.
Well, we see that now too with some of these laws they want to promulgate, the voting restrictions for women, women who have changed their names, making it harder for any woman who is married to vote. Do you see that as an outcropping of the, some of the indoctrinations that happened in the Jim Crow era, or do you see that as separate?
Well, there's a long history of voter suppression and of trying to skew the electorate towards voters that lawmakers think will favor them. It's this is an old story in the law of democracy is that lawmakers get elected, and this it happens to some extent in both political parties, right? And right, they try to skew the electorate and make it easier for people who support you to vote and make it more difficult for people who oppose your agenda to vote. So it certainly grows out of that tradition. And I think you're referring to the bill that that would enact new barriers to people with a married name from voting as
Yes,
a matter of
yes,
federal law.
right.
And it's all it's sort of all part of this this same movement of protecting, from the perspective of the authors of these bills, protecting the true electorate and right, ensuring that elections come out the right way. So
Mhm.
that's a little
Uh,
bit
I,
different. Oh, go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry, I wanted to stop you there. But this right way, whose right way? Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. Sort of when you look at the speeches of Donald Trump or other influential figures in the MAGA movement, there is a very clear sense that depending what you look at, we had things right in the 1950s, maybe, or we had things right, maybe, sometimes it goes back to the end of the 19th century, but there's an idealization of prior generations of American politics, and of course, right, sort of the TV image of those is that sort of a Leave It to Beaver society, but right, the defining features of those eras was that we lacked political equality, and there was not access to the franchise. People could not protest. People could not participate in civic life, and so right, we see right sort of the measures restricting voting, the measures that are putting barriers up to voting, laws that encourage in some cases armed vigilantes to police polling places, right, as a not too subtle mechanism of skewing politics and trying to right bring it back to the supposed golden age that was actually defined by striking political inequality.
Yeah, I remember I interviewed a gentleman who he was telling me the story about how he went to the polling places in California and Arizona. This is when William Rehnquist, before he became a Chief Justice, and how he was in line trying to dissuade people from voting, people that he didn't think fit the profile of the correct voter.
Hmm.
Um, and that was what, 50 something years ago, probably,
Hmm.
if not more. It seems like nothing has really changed. I think the, Donald Trump has brought out a lot of that maybe was repressed for a while, but it appears to me that he's got a lot of people behind him. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think when you look at American history, as a scholar, what we do is we take a step back and, we're looking in this book at the, 150-year history, if not the history all the way going back to the very first years of the Republic when Congress enacted the fugitive slave laws. And, one of the things that you see is a struggle between, on the one hand, those who conceive of American government, and this could be at the federal government, or this could be at the local level or the state level, as something that should be managed by a very restrictive set of people who look like me, versus, right, on the other hand, a broader understanding of democracy, which recognizes the political equality of everybody, and
Including
particularly
women.
including women, including, right, all kinds of marginalized groups. And one of the huge themes in American history is the battles between these two understandings of American democracy. Now, we're currently in a moment of retrenchment, where for very complicated historical reasons, people who take a more restrictive understanding of democracy are in control of the federal government and are in control of many state houses and many governors' offices. But when you zoom out a little bit and you sort of, you compare where we're at now to where we were at in the 60s or the 70s, it's still the case that the historical trend is towards a broader, more inclusive democracy. And one of the points that John and I make in the book is that turning to vigilantes is something that you do when you're trying to hold on to political power, right? If you have a message that resonates with voters, and people believe that you're going to successfully reduce the price of eggs, or build more housing, or whatever sort of the core bread and butter issues are, you don't need to
You don't need to resort to vigilantism,
you don't
right?
need to put guys with AR-15s at polling places, or
Right.
set up bounties for neighbors to snitch on people who are arranging gender affirming care for their kids, or traveling out of state for reproductive health care. You make your message, and you hopefully win. Where
It
we've
sounds
seen
like it's a fear-based phenomenon then.
Yeah, absolutely. And right, there's another parallel to Jim Crow there, right? Which is that using vigilantes is something that you do, right, when you're trying to hold on to an old political order, or in the case of the MAGA movement, trying to reimpose a political order that has been, right, in large ways dismantled by law. And right, you use vigilantes because vigilantes are a force multiplier, right? Right. The whole idea of vigilantes is that some people in society have more power than others, right? The guy at the polling place with an AR-15 isn't saying, "You're my political equal. Let's vote on this using majority rules."
No, it's
And the result
intimidation,
of that,
definitely.
determine what our policy is. They're saying there's one right way for this election to come out, and I'm going to impose my will to ensure that nobody who doesn't look right votes.
Gets to cast their vote, right,
Yeah.
right. And I just read recently that President Trump is looking to expand gun ownership rights. So that would in fact increase vigilantism, I would assume.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is one of the historical trends that is contributing to a resurgence in vigilantism, is the fact that gun rights, mostly as a result of state legislation, have expanded so dramatically. And so, just thinking about my lifetime, we've moved from, a nation where guns were not that prevalent a feature of public life to one where if you go to a protest or if you go to a rally, you're likely to see people carrying very dangerous firearms. And that changes our political culture, right? It changes the arguments people are willing to make. It changes the kind of events people are willing to go to. And of course, right, there's a subset of individuals who are, right, sort of eager to threaten other people and, right, to threaten them for exercising constitutional rights, which is where you really get into vigilante activity and you start worrying about, are these people, going to succeed in capturing democratic processes as almost happened on January 6th.
Right, right. Now let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the commerce power.
Mm,
The commerce power being, very important, states' rights. There was a very important case that came down in 2023 by the U.S. Supreme Court, National Pork Producers Council v. Ross.
mm.
Tell us a little bit about that case and what does that mean for the states and commerce in general?
Yeah, for sure. Well, we got thinking about Ross because we were thinking about what blue states or states with a democratic legislature, a democratic governor can do to resist the surge of vigilantism, and really how they can fight back to protect democracy against the threat of vigilantes. And Ross attracted our attention because, right, it involved an effort by California to use its market power to right, to resist what, from California's perspective, was a very alarming trend. So Ross involved, right, a ballot proposition in California, which said that if meat is sold in California, right, it has to be raised in a humane manner. And the standards were pretty minimal, right? It's something, like a pig has to have, enough space to turn around. It's sort of common sense stuff that hopefully would attract a wide variety of support. But an array of business interests lobbied against this bill and brought a legal challenge to the bill. And their challenge was that even though the proposition was limiting the meat that could be sold in California, it was really imposing standards on the national market. And they said that that was the case because California is such an important market and is such a big market that pig farmers would have no choice but to comply with these standards for all of the animals that they raised. And so California would in effect be setting a national regulatory standard. Now, this kind of argument is the kind of thing that usually finds a lot of success at the Supreme Court, right? Many academics have documented how our current Supreme Court is extraordinarily business friendly. When the Chamber of Commerce and trade groups line up to oppose a state law, they always receive a very favorable hearing at the court. But what's surprising about Ross is that California won. In an opinion by Justice Gorsuch, the Supreme Court said, yes, right, the states have this power to set standards for products that are sold within the state. And the fact that this may have spillover effects, right? The fact that this may influence the decisions of ranchers in other states, that doesn't make it unconstitutional. That doesn't mean that California is is regulating beyond its authority. And so, as John and I were thinking about potential responses to laws that encourage you to snitch on your neighbor, that restrict the flow of interstate travel, that roll back civil rights. Our thought was that, well, if this market power can be used, for something like protecting animal rights, couldn't states do the same thing to protect civil rights that are under attack from the spread of vigilantes? And so at the end of our book, we developed some proposals that use this power, which has been recognized by the Supreme Court, and we try to work through, well, how could a state like California or Washington or Illinois, how could they use their market power to encourage other states to stop attacking civil rights and to stop encouraging vigilantes?
And have you seen that being adopted, that philosophy? Have you seen it being adopted by other states?
Not really. There hasn't been a big surge of these laws. And I think that's partly because so much focus has been put, sort of in the past few months, in the past year, and responding to what the federal government is doing. And there's a real fear that, whether it's cutting off funding or rolling back civil rights protections, action by the federal government is sort of, the current five-alarm threat that states are facing. But this is, we provide a whole host of model laws in the book, right? This is something that, and we certainly, sympathize with state attorneys general and state legislatures that are trying to make sense of the chaos that surrounds us, and and sort of understand how to respond to all of the things that are going on right now. But these are laws that can be adopted at any point, and hopefully, sort of when we're not facing as many crises and as many emergencies, there's something that state legislatures will return to.
Now, wasn't there a slew of blue state legislatures that were behind this California proposition that went to the Supreme Court?
If I'm remembering correctly, there was a group of what we would think of as blue states that sided with California. And it may not even have been exclusively blue states. So there was sort of, there was an interesting debate in that case between states that were trying to protect themselves from what they saw as extraterritorial regulation, and states that were trying to protect what they saw as their ability to regulate their own market. And so, the lineup in that case was, it was kind of interesting because you had states taking different positions on whether the kind of measure that California enacted was constitutional or not.
Yeah, California is one of the biggest markets in the world. It's a state, but it's kind of like a country in their market and buying power. So they have a lot of influence. So if anybody wants to sell in their state, they have to abide by state laws, which I think that is just bolstering the states' rights argument. So that can be applied to other issues as well. Now let's transition a little bit to that Christian nationalism. I want to get more into that. And I know you spoke about it a little bit briefly, but I want to get a little bit more out of that. And why do you think, well, for example, January 6th, that to me is the culmination of Christian nationalism, that it's kind of like the fulcrum. What do you see were the underpinnings of that, and where do you see that going forward?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, so when we talk about Christian nationalism, there's a belief that the United States is a Christian nation. And when Christian nationalists say that, they don't, they don't mean it in a soft sense, such that, a majority or plurality of people happen to be of the Christian faith, but they mean that a specific reactionary set of religious views about how a society should be run, how the family should be run, who should make decisions, men, and all these kinds of matters should conform to right-wing religious beliefs. Now, it enters the picture, for a couple reasons. One is that a number of leading figures in the MAGA movement adhere to a version of Christian nationalism. So Russell Vought, who is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, which is behind this sort of flurry of executive orders that's coming out of the White House these days, has advocated for Christian nationalist beliefs. It's also something that a lot of folks in the militia movement believe in very strongly, right? They believe in this, this idea of a patriarchal, Christianity infused form of citizenship, and that it's relevant to things like January 6th because this supplies sort of the ideological machinery that motivates people to do something like attack the Capitol, right? From their perspective, right, America is a Christian nation. Again, understanding Christianity not in a pluralistic sense, but right as as associated with right a very restrictive sort of historical traditionalist beliefs, and they see their way of life being under attack from people like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and sort of in general a diverse, inclusive society, and they right, they really view that as an existential threat, and that's what motivates people to to attack Congress, and to start being believing lies about the election being stolen, and what have you. And so right, it's both a governing framework, right, on the one hand, that is informing how MAGA uses government power when they win elections, and right, it's a broad-based ideological framework that that foot soldiers, whether they're members of militias or people snitching on their neighbors for getting healthcare, what have you, subscribe to, and right, and it binds the entire movement together.
Now, how do you see this fitting in with our standing in the international arena? Do you see this as making the country stronger, weaker, or in between?
It unquestionably makes the United States weaker, right? The United States is most effective on the world stage when when our domestic politics is governed by the rule of law, when civil rights are respected, when
And due
when
process rights
due
are
process is
respected.
respected, people aren't disappeared to right to prisons in El Salvador, um, and right there's a relationship between civil rights at home and the rule of law at home and the United States standing on the international stage, which was appreciated by people in the second half of the 20th century, right? There's many academics, there's many scholars who have argued that the thing that finally pushed elites in Washington, D.C. to take seriously Jim Crow and to develop political responses at the federal level to Jim Crow was the very real way in which it was harming the United States standing on the international stage. And we are in the process of losing that. If due process is only extended to people with the right beliefs, if the rule of law only applies in certain courts and you can only get a fair hearing in certain courts, if the Supreme Court simply rubber stamps whatever the executive branch does, then the United States' position as an alternative to authoritarian regimes that you see in Russia, Turkey, China, right, is really lost. And right, and the argument becomes that, well, all countries are thuggish, right, and no countries really respect human rights or liberal values. And so there's a not too complicated way in which the kind of domestic discord that is fostered by laws emboldening vigilantes, right, translates into weakened standing on the international stage. And when you lose standing on the international stage, you're in a position where only threats of force, right, only the threat of war, only the kind of economic sanctions that are being tossed around now remain as a way of exercising power. And I think we're all seeing right now that that's enormously destabilizing. If you have a retirement, we're filming this at the beginning of April 2025, and if you have a retirement account, its value has gone up and down 15% this week,
Because of tariffs, because of
because
tariffs.
of instability, right? Because of
Right.
because of the fact that the United States is not leading from a position of strength, but instead trying to bully other countries into
Mhm.
conforming with a specific set of views.
Yeah, it's no longer seen as a stable and reliable partner in many of the nations around the world, and that's
Right.
troubling.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, it's a huge change in the world order. People are talking about the dollar no longer being the United States reserve currency. And that is linked to the erosion of civil rights domestically, the right, sort of, the more discord, right, the more infighting there is at the domestic level, the less attractive the United States looks to international investors, right, as people to people looking for somewhere safe to put their money and to make investments.
Now, what can people do? We talk about vigilantes. Let's talk about good vigilantes. What can the people do? Do you have suggestions to try to turn this around, this trajectory we're on right now?
Well, folks will have to pick up the book to see our full menu of state laws that we suggest state legislatures adopt. Um, we break down things that, we focus on blue states because we think it's very important for individuals who oppose this movement and don't want to see the United States descend into a vigilante nation to use sources of power that they hold. And right, we begin from the idea that blue states should provide refuge. If you are, being punished or for teaching American history or for trying to get reproductive health care, we're tragically in a situation where really for the first time since the fall of Jim Crow, we're seeing substantial numbers of people moving from state to state in order to secure civil rights. And one of the terrible things about our current political situation is that blue states, which respect civil rights, tend to have a really unaffordable cost of living, right? Tend to be places where it's difficult to get established. That tend to have sometimes regulations in place that keep people from building, keep people from moving. And so, right, we think that, right, sort of the first order of business is making sure that blue states are a welcoming environment for people who may be fleeing red states, right, because their families can't live there or, they can't pursue their jobs there. After sort of get beyond those, we get into strategies building on Ross and building on, right, sort of what California did with Prop 12, where we're looking at how blue states can use their economic power to, to resist vigilantes and to encourage firms and to encourage red states to stop supporting them, right, and to respect the civil rights that we had in place until very recently. And then finally, right, we close the book by looking at more aggressive measures that blue states can take. One example is we're seeing, again, for the first time since Jim Crow, right, concerted efforts to interfere with the right of interstate travel. And for a long time, we relied on federal law to protect that right. But for reasons that we get into in the book, right, federal protections are weak or difficult to make use of. And so, just as an example, we say, right, blue states should be enacting measures that punish people who interfere with the right of interstate travel, that allow you as a citizen to sue people who interfere with the right of interstate travel. And we think, right, it's only through these kind of, right, countermeasures and pushing back that will be able to stop the vigilante movement. Because right now it's very lopsided, where you have red states and now the federal government enacting measure after measure that encourages vigilantism and very little pushback from other states.
So basically, it's going to come down to the people taking to the streets, calling their senators, calling their representatives, and using their dollar to sway things in the right direction.
There's no substitute for participating in democracy, and this has always been the case. And so it's this is the moment that we're in, and the struggle that we have to fight. But we should recognize that this is what it is to be a citizen in a democratic society. This is right. These are the kind of struggles that people have engaged in throughout all of American history, and right, we're simply continuing the story.
Right. The good vigilantism of the dollar that will get their attention. Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. I enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Great to be with you. Thanks for the discussion.
I want to thank our guest, Professor David Noll, for sharing his insights and opinions on issues threatening our democracy and what we can do to save it. I also want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. For more information on today's topic and our guest, visit us online at thelegaledition.com. As always, this information is for educational purposes only. It is not to be construed as legal or personal advice. And please consult a qualified practitioner as to your own legal or personal legal needs. And don't forget, subscribe online. Find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and you can find us now on Blue Sky.